thank you for inviting me to present this work. And I wanted to pick up on what Fred Moten had talked about, and facetiously I could start with a true anecdote that this morning I brought Fred Moten's paper that I had printed from his attachment, and I had marked a passage I wanted to quote in the margin, and I realized that I didn't bring the right paper. So I'm unable to do that, and it somehow fits in with my argument about a disappearing archive that still needs to be transcribed and restituted. But more seriously, I can say that I'm trying to also to investigate what Fred was mentioning about the troubling of the voice or disturbance that also would have a relation to truth. And my point of departure is a quote from Assia Djebar's L'amour, la fantasia, a passage that's quite well known by Assia Djebar scholars. In this passage, she's recalling a moment in the French painter Eugène Fromentin's memoir of his stay in Algeria after the conquest. And I quote, "In June 1853, he visits La Goutte, which is occupied after a terrible siege. He evokes then a sinister detail. Excuse me. Exiting the oasis, Fromentin picks up in the dust the cut-off hand of an anonymous Algerian woman. Then he throws it away on his path. Later I seize this living hand, the hand of mutilation and of memory, excuse me, and I attempt to make it take the kalam." So my point of departure is this: what happens when the Francophone reader encounters in a French text, in the French language, an Arabic word like kalam? What does this difference make possible? And beyond that, my question would be, what is idiomaticity in a post-colonial text and context? Not only what will that language write? And the second part of the paper would be when I read Algerian writers, I see that many of them find it necessary to return or to turn to a phase of amnesia in the relation of France to Algeria. And what interests me in the Djebar I will mention is that together with that amnesia, there is an account of memory loss, a memory blank, excuse me, brought in by a colonization. What interests me is that she doesn't rush into fill in that blank with a kind of counter history to the French colonization. Rather, what she's attempting to do is to restitute that blank as blank, to transcribe it, which is I think also tells something of an impossibility of recuperation. One way I am trying to address these questions of idiomaticity, memory loss, are beside Djebar through three authors. Jean-François Lyotard with this question of the different, Jacques Derrida and the monolingualism of the other, and Abdelkabir Khatibi in Amour bilingue. I don't think I have the time to go in detail through all these texts, but I may have, I may make gestures to them, toward them. So, so if one accepts that with a word like kalam, Djebar promises another inscription through the Arabic word thrown in a French text. I'm asking what does the difference stand for, that interruption of the patterns of the adverse language? Is she suggesting that there is a resisting idiomaticity that can be read or heard but not quite comprehended by a Francophone reader? And here I want to recall that in post-independence Algeria, the issue of idiomaticity was not only linked to the expression of discourses which had been silenced under the French rule, but as crucially, the question was to determine in what language that idiomaticity would speak or could be written. And it is very difficult to assign a simple answer to that question, and you cannot easily assign a political affiliation to a choice of a language in which to write and publish. Some authors assess that there are as many as 17 languages spoken in Algeria today. But for my argument, I want to say that the decision to write in a language after the independence was often already preempted by the very structure of French colonial education. As an author says, the French government went so far as to classify Arabic as a foreign language in Algeria in 1938. So the very choice of a writing language was often not really one. And I think that this is a singular situation for that generation of writers, which is neither exactly that of other Maghrebian writers. For example, Abdelkebir Khatibi writes that he could also write in his mother tongue with great enjoyment. And it's not the situation either told by Jacques Derrida in the monolingualism of the other, which he sums up in that difficult sentence, I have only one language, yet it is not mine. So neither Djebar nor Derrida, for different reasons, can rely or simply fall back on bilingualism. That is, as Derrida says, a single mother tongue plus another language. And both Djebar and Derrida show that the range of interdictions at work, as far as their access to languages, is particularly manifested in the context of the French school. So it becomes emblematic of a more general cultural inscription under colonial conditions. In the monolingualism, I just want to refer briefly a few interdicts. The first concerns the study of Arabic or Berber languages. The second, an impossible return to a mother tongue. And third, the deprivation of an authorized mother tongue in the sense that Derrida's relation to the French language would come from this first double interdict, neither Arabic nor Judeo-Spanish. So that's one side. The other thing in Derrida's monolingualism is that the story of the colonized that he tells also shows that the dispossession towards an authorized mother tongue exceeds the position of the colonized. There is never a relation of belonging, property, and mastery to language. As Derrida says, language is ex-appropriation, so that would be the case even for the colonizer or for the master. And with this notion of ex-appropriation, Derrida not only formulates a way of going beyond the opposition between appropriation and alienation, but also says that it constitutes the only chance that is possible. fast here. But this possibility to determine and denounce naturalized appropriations of a language corresponds in Derrida to a heterology, an opening to the other, for saying that one speaks one language that one does not have also means that language is always the other's. And here I quote from Derrida, coming from the other, remaining with the other, and returning to the other. It is a monolingualism, yes, but of the other, a proposition which immediately co-determines an ethics of relation, exchange, gift, and hospitality. The monolingualism of the other also makes the other come, is the coming of the other. And with this notion of exappropriation, I will argue that there is a resonance also in Djebar's work. There is another important Francophone Algerian writer, Kateb Yassine, who, after the independence, stopped writing in French and turned to the theater for the rest of his career, in the same way as Djebar, who had started publishing novels, stopped for a while and turned to television and cinema. I think for both of them this was a way of using vernacular Arabic rather than the modern standard Arabic that they had trouble mastering, inverted commas. And what this points out is that Djebar wanted to turn to Arabic. She said so in an interview, but she also found out that this turn to could not be a return to the comfort of a mother tongue, for instance. So her interrogation concerned rather the decision whether to continue or to stop writing altogether. Therefore, to sum up briefly, the dilemma that these writers, Kateb Yassine, Djebar, and others, inherited from post-colonization was not the deprivation of a mother tongue, but the fact that their language of writing, langue d'écriture, they had acquired at school, and their national language, after the independence, modern standard Arabic, neither of these language was their mother tongue. And now I want to address this issue of idiomaticity between two parties when the settlement of the conflict that opposes them appears in the idiom of one of them, while the tort from which the other suffers cannot signify itself in its idiom. So what is depicting here is that there is a shared idiom between one of the parties and the judge, to the exclusion of the plaintiff, and that makes that exclusion, that makes of the plaintiff a victim. What interests me in his argument is that what he's saying about the receivability in the idiom of the tribunal, for instance, what does it depend on? What does this receivability depend on? At least two things, on the evidence, on proof, on what is demonstrable, and the difficulty, one of his examples is the survivor of the Shoah, when you cannot show any proof, you don't have anything to demonstrate. And in another context, that of Algeria, it would be the disappearance of the archive, or the impossibility of having recorded some of the injustices. The second thing that makes for the receivability of an idiom in Lyotard is the search for an agreement or a consensus. And as he shows, this search for an agreement or a consensus excludes or can eliminate the other. He demonstrates that, maybe that's not the right term, he analyzes that through the through some of Plato's dialogues. I think this is an important point because it problematizes an easy conclusion that if we all understand each other, there will be no difference. Because once we understand that consensus means the exclusion of some, the problem of justice still remains intact. The other thing that Lyotard says about the different would concern its time and its space. It is the time of the not yet. Give a quote. The different is the unstable state and instant of language, wherein something which must be put into phrases cannot yet be. So this time of the not yet is both the time of injustice and the time when the call for justice in another idiom can be made. And now I want to read a little bit, a few pages. What I find interesting is that when Lyotard looks for a way out of the different, that is out of injustice, he says that first, he has shown that a search for and reliance on a common idiom actually rests on the exclusion of some. Yet, instead of urging the demise of the idiomatic, which could have been taken to be an important factor of difference, Lyotard asks, on the contrary, for new idioms, new phrases to link. I quote, "This requires new rules for the formation and linking of phrases." Another quote, "Bear witness to difference by finding idioms for them." So the answer is not less idioms, but more idioms. The whole difficulty will concern this new idiomaticity of the idiom, because I would argue that in Lyotard, the idiomaticity of the idiom makes possible both the different and its contrary. And in another passage where he speaks about giving the different its due, I'm not sure that he would completely agree with me there, but I think that if we want to learn something from the situation of the different, we should pay attention to that moment where there was silence, impossibility of expressing that resistance. If we want to have as yet unheard of idiom to be just, if we want this new idiom to be just, that is, if we don't want to reiterate the different in the old terms, which always know what to say, I believe that we should keep intact a certain moment of resistance or difficulty or disturbance or troubling of the voice. Now, to go back to Djebar, using the word kalam in her French text. There is a passage in Khatibi in Amour bilingue, which makes me think of that gesture. I quote from Khatibi. "He calmed down instantly when an Arabic word, kalma, appeared." So again, what is at stake here? I believe it's neither simply an exoticization or creolization of French. You could say that Khatibi's sentence is not opposed to the kind of dislocation of the French idiom in which the foreign word would abruptly interrupt the other language. Rather, it increases the impact of the dislocation by making it less locatable. Because what's happening in an example where calm and kalma affect each other, there is a defeat for logic. The apparent diglossia, French and Arabic of this example, is not bringing together, but it's rather bringing out a homophony which is paradoxically endowed with and entrusted to difference through the recognizable harmonious similarity. So I would say that here what we have is a kind of dissemination. The two words collide with each other and bring associations that are affecting each other and affecting other words still in a way that is difficult to stop. It's not a process of consolidating abundance where you would have one language plus another language, but it's a kind of new space for writing and thought that inscribes a tangential semantic recognition which implicates, indeed may seem to risk confusing one language with another while forbidding stable reappropriations. So I think that Djebar is performing a similar gesture when she uses kalam, but she takes it in another direction, because as you heard, Dina was pronouncing beautifully and I'm not, the word kalam. To a French ear, mishearing kalam as kalam, or calamus in English, the term designates a writing instrument, one that was used by the ancients, a reed pen, a stylus, or a style. Sometimes the term may also refer to a manuscript that was written with a reed pen. So, whereas Khatibi relies on difference or dissemination, Djebar, I would argue, promotes, on the contrary, the premises of the receivability in French of a term, an Arabic term like kalam. Because unlike kalma, the Arabic word in Khatibi's sentence, kalam can be heard by a francophone, non-Arabophone speaker. Yet at this juncture, receivability, the very milieu or meeting ground for comprehension and understanding, are now turned around, and francophones find themselves in the position where that possibility or that sight takes place not in French but in Arabic. At the moment of the flash of recognition of convergences, we are already on other grounds. So if I'm right to see in Djebar's move when using kalam an attempt not to undermine or implode the French from within, but to bring the language or the locutor to recognize themselves at the moment when the foreign is heard or read, what is happening? And my question with that is, why is Djebar bringing us, French speakers, to the Algerian site again? And it seems to me that this is a movement in her writing, that her point is to bring us to a site. So this is maybe the second part of my argument. Like Rachid Boudjedra, who talks in Lettres Algériennes of amnesia and even of aphasia in the relation of France to Algeria, Djebar diagnoses a forgetting involved in the occupation of the Algerian site. And again, I was right to see in the different a movement that was striving to keep in the formulation of a new idiom the mark of the reticence or silence of what could not as yet find a language in the victim's tort. So what I'm trying to elucidate is how Djebar attempts to transcribe not only the contents of a lost memory, but the memory loss, the very memory loss. How is it possible to tell the memory blank, I quote from her, or the occulted transmission? And here I had another section that I have to sum up from Vaste et la prison. There is a section of that book where Djebar reconstitutes and imagines what happens when Europeans discover archaeological treasures of antiquity in Maghreb. In that case, it's an archaeological site of Douga near Carthage in Tunisia. And there are two things that she is interested in that scene. Is the question of bilingualism, which is not one, and the question of forgetting and erasure. So the scene of forgetting, first of all, at a very in a very simple way, the stone. There is a stone in that archaeological site that bears a bilingual inscription, and that stone has been found and forgotten several times. That is, that people were running into the stone, were taking notes, the notes disappeared, then people were running into the stone again, or not knowing that it had been found. So that's the first step. The second thing is a bilingual inscription. Here she wants to deconstitute a certain hierarchy between languages, bilingualism implying often a hierarchy. So one language is known, and this is the Punic signs of former Carthage, and the other inscription is unknown, and finally it will be found out that this was actually the most familiar, the indigenous language, Berber, although it was written in an alphabet whose existence was itself unknown. So what was lost was not the language which was spoken, but the fact that it could be transcribed into a specific alphabet, because it had long been thought that Berber could only be transcribed into Arabic, the Arabic alphabet. So, let me finish briefly. In the episode of the Douga ruins, what interests me is that Djebar does not break the silence dissimulating the message of the inscription, which emphasizes the greater relevance of examining the very condition of plurilingualism. Even when depicting the scholarly work on the inscription, she is focusing on the investigation conducted into the name and functions of the unknown language. What also interests me is that she explains that there were actually two stones. The one with the bilingual inscription, but another one, perhaps the most important of the two, she says, had been in part erased. The victim of erosion, it has almost totally vanished. So the stone doubles itself, but this time writing, and in which languages and which alphabets, cannot in any simple sense lend itself to the hermeneutic achievements previously accomplished when interpreting the bilingual inscription. If I am right to suggest that with that inscription, Djebar is at all events less interested in the decoding of the message than in the exposure of a linguistic condition that goes beyond bilingualism, then the second instance of a lapidary writing, which has almost totally vanished, serves to confirm and accentuate the first point. And I'm being lapidary myself, telegraphic, but what I'm interested in Djebar's text is the different ways in which she pays attention to vanishing inscriptions. And for her, that would be at least part of the task of the Algerian writer. She has this expression, the Algerian writer has to be a writer for the trace. I'm interested in this pour la trace. Why not a writer of the trace? No, a writer for the trace. She says, how to testify through writing, the terrain has slipped under your steps. Or again, it is your dispossession that you transmit, inherit my non-inheritance. So as you have heard, I have talked more of traces than of race, and I feel vindicated through Jacques Derrida's talk yesterday. But I wanted to go briefly as a conclusion to what Jacques Derrida says on the trace, and to make a link with Djebar. I would like to argue that Djebar's claim that she is writing for the trace, or her attention to inscriptions in a process of erasure, can be related to this thought. When Derrida writes about the trace, he is first inheriting other styles of writing or other texts, for example in Freud, Levinas, and Heidegger. And with the trace, Derrida thinks an other of ontology, what he has called hauntology. Trace is what arrives through erasure, what therefore does not present itself as such. I quote from Writing and Difference, traces thus produce the space of their inscription only by acceding to the period of their erasure. From the beginning, in the present of their first impression, they are constituted by the double force of repetition and erasure, legibility and illegibility. In the trace, what seems to remain or to be retained keeps in itself or is haunted by the mark of another. What is called the present or presence is constituted by this relation to the other. As Derrida shows in Margins of Philosophy, the location of the trace is also untenable if one takes into account the relation of and the relation within the trace to another than itself, hence the mention of effacement or erasure. So it is a strange topography and toponymy. And that last quote I will give from Djebar, I think, testifies to this strange toponymy. She says of her writing in French, of French as bouti, you say that word, bouti? Torn from the closest neighbor, pour, a speech anchored in a memory of the populated shadow.